Hey everyone. We've discussed the shift from nomadic hunting and gathering cultures to fixed settlements centered on agriculture. Today, we're going to go to the Nile River Valley of Egypt, one of two areas where Western civilization first developed to high levels of complexity. The other is in Mesopotamia. Your textbook talks about indigenous civilizations of pre Columbian America that built similar structures to the Great Pyramids. Fundamental geometric forms are among the earliest colossal structures. They express in stone the idea of mightiness, earthbound but reaching toward the heavens. The map of Egypt demonstrates the relatively protected environment in which Egyptian civilization was able to mature with the natural barrier of the desert to the east and to the west, the Mediterranean Sea to the north. It was protected from invasion and gave a sense of security. The map also demonstrates the most important geographic feature in Egypt, the Nile River. It's the longest river in the world. It's over 4,000 miles long. The Nile was a source of water and fish for the Egyptians, and thus made life possible in the otherwise barren desert. The river rises due to rains in Central Africa during the summer and overflows its banks in Egypt in September and October, leaving a deposit of nutrient bearing silt that enriches the soil and allows lush crops to grow, making it crucial to agriculture in the region. This sort of regular and predictable pattern of flooding and renewing the soil doubtlessly played a role in the development of Egyptian beliefs about death and renewal in human existence, symbolizing rebirth. Outside of the floodplains in the desert is where men hunted and where the ancient Egyptians located their cemeteries. The Nile was also the principal means of travel and a communication line for ancient Egyptians. They developed various types of boats, including cargo, passenger, funerary, and naval vessels, to journey on the river. A large part of life in Lower Egypt was based on the papyrus plant. It was used to make mats, sandals, rafts, and writing material. It fueled fires. It was eaten, and its flowers were collected and offered to the gods. In the arts, the papyrus plant symbolized the world that emerged from the primordial waters. And in architecture, papyrus formed pillars were used to hold up the roofs of the temples. The pillar tops would have either closed or open capitals, symbols of how the papyrus flowers close up at night and open as the sun rises. Since, man has succeeded in taming the Nile River, destroying the reed's habitat, and caused it to become extinct in Egypt. It has been reintroduced on a small scale in the late 20th century to satisfy demands made by Western tourists. As a writing material, papyrus was used to make paper since the late 4th millennium. It was produced in sheets by layering lengths of wet papyrus pith side by side, adding a second layer at a right angle on top, and fusing the pith by applying pressure. The product was then smoothed by rubbing it with a stone or shell. The sheets were stuck together with starch-based glues to form scrolls. The lower part of the plant stays immersed in water. It's soft and it's less suited for making writing materials than the tough upper part. It wasn't wasted though, as it could be cooked and eaten, so the papyrus also serves as food. It's also used for rafts and boats. The first river crafts made in Egypt are believed to be papyrus rafts. Reeds were tied together into bundles to make boat-like rafts. Wooden boats were expensive. The raw material was of low quality and in short supply, and carpentry was a specialized trade. For the ordinary Delta dweller who needed to get around in a region where there are few roads and unbridged canals, the advantages of a boat had over a raft were offset by the easy availability of the papyrus and the small construction costs. Looking at more building materials, in the absence of rain, the scarcity of wood, and an abundance of sunshine, it made adobe the preferred building material. Loamy Nile mud mixed with straw resulted in surprisingly strong bricks. As long as groundwater did not dissolve their foundations and floods did not reach them, well-tended mud brick walls could stand for generations. So only in the rare cases of stone being more readily available than river mud would have been to people They typically don't live in stone buildings. Even pharaohs lived in brick palaces, and rock was really primarily reserved for the dead and the gods. The ancient Egyptians did use mortar. They used a mixture of gypsum and quartz with small amounts of lime as mortar. They did not know about the hard setting lime plaster that would be invented by the Greeks. Again, the building material of wood, it is not very available, and so it was used sparingly. Doors and shutters were made of it, and sometimes upper story floors. But the only native trees that were really easily available and with stems straight and long enough to be used for this purpose were palm trees. And the palm tree wood is not very strong. The longest beams that could be cut from local wood were only 3 or 4 meters long. So if the ceiling was wider than that, it had to be supported with columns made of mud and bundled reeds. On top of the wooden beams, planks were laid and covered with a thin layer of earth. When a building was abandoned, all wooden and stone parts, such as doors, lintels, etc., would have been removed so that they could be reused somewhere else. So, in housing, the common building style was greatly influenced by climate. There's very little rain and there's a lot of sun. So, foundations were generally non existent. The soil that's above groundwater level was baked rock hard by the sun and really just needed some leveling out. Another aspect of the building was the flat roofs. So, in where we live, we have steeply angled or pitched roofs. And the reason for that is because we have a lot of rain. So why the flat roof in Egypt? There's really no need to repel rain because there isn't very much of it. So the roof actually ends up being a place that can also be used for cooking, storage, and relaxation. Flat roofs can also be used as sleeping quarters on really hot, dry nights. Another aspect of the housing is that you would have what you call a tripartite plan, or basically a plan separated in 3 parts. So you see a reception room, a central hall or living room, and a private area. The ceiling of the central hall was typically higher than the adjacent rooms. So think about this. Why would we have the center room with a ceiling higher than the side rooms? So if you look at the pictures in the slide, if you think about it, it allows for this room that has the higher ceiling height to have a little bit of area exposed to the exterior. So you can put windows in there. And what that allows for is being able to draw sunlight down into more of the center of the space, sunlight and air, so some ventilation. In the more substantial houses, the rooms would have actually been arranged around an inner courtyard, and so for all of the same reasons, for the ventilation and the sunlight. But a lot of our knowledge on the way Egyptians lived comes from written and illustrated texts, inscriptions, paintings, and furniture. It was incredibly well preserved in the Great Pyramids. We'll talk about those monumental building projects towards the end of this lecture. The interiors of these homes and palaces had really strong, colorful character in red, yellow, blue, and green. Plant and animal life of the environment were often used as decorative themes for paint. And the color you can see in the images progressively increases in intensity from floor to ceiling to encourage vertical movement. In the image, there's also 2 other things I'd like you to take note of. There's a zigzag treatment for one of the sections of the ceiling, and another section has a grape leaf design. These are symbols of the homeowner, whose name is Senefer, and they're symbols of his life. The zigzags represent water. Senefer was the mayor of Thebes, which is located on the Nile River. He was also the superintendent of granaries and gardens, the reason for the grape leaf decoration. So again, Egypt's climate is really hot and dusty, and the ancient Egyptian home was pretty sparsely furnished. What they did have, however, they invented, and their designs are still used today. Egyptians didn't have much access to wood, as we've talked about, so they often built light furniture made of reeds, rushes, and palm fronds, even in wealthy homes. When they did use wood, it was imported from other regions, such as Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and southern areas of Africa. Since suitable wood was scarce and expensive, every scrap had to be utilized. Sometimes they would even put a thick veneer of a fine wood just pegged over a less valuable wood or glued to it if it was a thin veneer. Due to the short lengths of local woods, the Egyptians began using the scarf joint which you see illustrated in the slide. And they would do this so that they could join two pieces of wood together and extend the length. The scarf joint was used to join these two pieces end to end. And then you would take wet strips of leather and wrap those around the structural parts and maybe even thread it through drilled holes. When the leather dried, it would shrink up and tighten the joint. So furniture was also often strengthened by angular or curved pieces of wood. And as we go through the next couple of slides, you'll see several examples of furniture with curves to them. And that this is why it actually strengthens the piece. Another thing to note about furniture is that the Egyptian carpenter had several tools at his disposal, like mallets and chisels with copper blades. We're just starting to see a little bit of metal implemented into tools. And another tool that you see here in the slide is the bow drill. So one of the earliest types of seating developed was the stool. It would have had a woven seat surface, and houses of all levels of society would have a few low stools. But people often simply just sat on the ground. And so because of this, the design of the stools were still very low and more comfortable to people who are accustomed to sitting on the ground than we would find them. Many stools often folded for portability. They're held at the X crossings of their base by bronze rivets and washers. Officials and kings seem to feel the need to have a support behind them, likely to designate them as a seat of higher authority, and the world's first chairs were born. In the beginning, the support was really low, just enough to keep sort of like a cushion-like pad of linen in place. Most examples of furniture that we have represent those of royalty or upper classes because they were sealed in tombs and preserved due to climatic conditions. Many of the more elaborate pieces of furniture have animal legs. Although modern furniture has roots in Egyptian design, today you rarely see an entire animal leg used as a base. The legs were also raised on a little spool. So this raised the stool off the sandy floor in this dusty environment and increased the person's importance by separating them from the ground. Hieroglyphics and protective symbols were often used symbolically and as decorative motifs. Here, the symbol in the center is the god Bez, a deity who protected the home. On either side are amulets associated with the goddess Isis and the Djed pillar, which symbolized stability and endurance. In these higher back chairs, construction supported an angled back to allow for a gentle recline, kind of like the first ergonomics. So also notice how the animal legs of this chair all face in one direction. If you look at chairs with paw feet from different cultures or even things made today, the front and back feet often face in opposite directions. But the ancient Egyptians had really strong concepts about the orientation of the body in many of their practices, especially those involving the afterlife. And so this is really consistent with their ideas to design furniture in an anatomical way, the way that the animal's legs would need to face to walk. When Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun at Thebes in November of 1922, the world was mesmerized as gold burial equipment, lavishly embellished furniture, and other items emerged from a royal resting place that had miraculously survived almost intact since antiquity. The discovery yielded the largest and most elaborate collection of ancient Egyptian furniture known. Much of what we know of furniture from this period comes from what was preserved in this tomb. It was the belief of ancient Egyptians that possessions could be used in the afterlife. So as a result, the rich and the pharaohs were buried with many of their possessions. They believed that the journey to the afterlife was long, and so Egyptians were buried with food, water, and wine to help them on their travels. In Tutankhamun's tomb, archaeologists found 36 jars of vintage wine and 8 baskets of fruit. This is the golden throne of King Tut. It is adorned with gold-plated wood with semi-precious stones and artwork showing his wife holding a cup and spreading perfume on his collar. Typical to chairs, it has animal legs, all facing one direction, and it has the ergonomically inclined back. Now, only the wealthy slept on beds. The poor had to make do with a mattress filled with straw or wool, a mat, or even the plain floor. But if you did have a bed, this is the Egyptian model. So notice a few unique things about it. One, it's inclined. Our beds are perfectly flat. And two, it actually has a footboard, not a headboard. And then third, the sleeper uses a prop for the head, which is probably the most interesting and bizarre part. Here's a person using one today. The Egyptians actually slept on their sides, and so the headrests were about shoulder height. So you can see her using this wooden headrest, kind of like our pillow, to sleep. Here's a better look at that. The headrest for every night was made of wood, and it consists of three parts. So it has a curved sort of pillow, the vertical shaft, and the horizontal base. And they're usually all separate pieces doweled together. But of course, you also needed a headrest for the afterlife. So some of the funerary headrests are very fine quality, but pretty impractical materials, such as ivory or alabaster. So to bring this full circle back to architecture, we'll look at the monumental structures the ancient Egyptians built. As we asked with Stonehenge, how did people move the giant building stones of the pyramids? We know the wheel has not been invented yet. We do assume the Egyptians had levers to help them lift and transport their giant obelisks. This is an essential device to the ancient world. The image that you're looking at here is the unfinished obelisk at stone quarries in Aswan, Egypt. It's the largest known ancient obelisk. It is nearly 1/3 larger than any ancient Egyptian obelisk ever actually erected. So, if you haven't heard this term obelisk before, it's been copied many times in the modern world. Think about the Washington Monument. Same structure. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara is the world's first monumental stone building in ancient Egypt. Built around 2650 BC, it rises 6 stages to a height of 200 feet. It was actually designed by a commoner named Imhotep, who rose to counsel the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Djoser. Imhotep is the first architect-engineer that we know by name. This pyramid becomes a prototype for the design of the pyramids at Giza a century and a half later. The pyramids of Giza were created to house the remains of the pharaohs who built them. They are essentially tombstones. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the oldest and largest of the three. This pyramid was built by 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. Khufu chose the plateau of Giza on the west bank of the Nile, which is just southwest of modern-day Cairo. The Great Pyramid stands at 450 feet and was the tallest structure in the world until 1311, when the tower of Lincoln Cathedral actually surpassed it. Its base spreads over 13 acres of land. And one of the most interesting points is that the base points of the pyramid, the 4 corners, are very nearly accurate to be aligned with the 4 cardinal compass points, based on true north, not magnetic north. The 2 pyramids beside it were added by Khufu's successors, Khafre and Munkar. These pyramids are the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only wonders to actually remain largely intact. All 3 are monuments to the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife. Giant tombs, each constructed to house the burial chamber of a single pharaoh, containing not only his mummified remains, but also the hoard of his personal effects, the household goods, the jewelry, and statuary. All of that would allow his soul to enjoy its eternal stay in the next world. It was believed that these objects placed in the tomb could be taken into the afterlife. So objects too large to be placed in a tomb, a house or a boat, for example, could be represented by models of these things. So in some tombs, you see small scale models of houses, shops, and other facilities of everyday life that have survived and gives us a lot of additional information about aspects of the ancient Egyptian life. The Great Pyramid at Giza was originally built almost 30 feet higher than you see it today, but over the centuries, large quantities of stone were pillaged from the top. Originally, the Great Pyramid was covered by highly polished white limestone. Some of these casing stones, like this one, can still be seen around the base of the pyramid. These stones dressed the entire exterior of the pyramids and made the sides a single smooth plane from top to bottom. In 1300 CE, a massive earthquake loosened many of the outer casing stones. Some were carted away by later Muslim rulers to build mosques and fortresses in Cairo. What is left behind is the underlying core structure, a rougher stone that gives the pyramids the stair-step silhouette they have today. So what you see today is essentially the skeleton. So back to the big question. How did ancient Egyptians haul roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 9 tons, from quarries many miles away, and then raise them hundreds of feet in the air? Imhotep wanted to use better quality white stone for the casing layer, brought from quarries on the other side of the Nile at Tora. Dense granite blocks were required for the burial chamber in the pyramid's center, and to serve as the support for the corridors. You really needed that stronger stone on the inside. So this stone could only be supplied from the quarry at Aswan, which is nearly 600 miles south. Only the interior stones were able to be quarried nearby. We can only speculate, but it seems likely that after being cut from the limestone ledges of the Upper Nile or from granite quarries in Aswan, the blocks were transported by river barge to Giza. Many experts believe that the Egyptians built a ramp of brick, soil, and sand around the pyramid as it was constructed. The blocks could be pushed and hauled up the slope on sleds, then fitted into place. In recent years, Jean-Pierre Houdin, a French architect who has spent more than a decade studying the Great Pyramid, suggests in addition to an external ramp that was used to deliver stones only for the lower third of the pyramid, there was a second spiraling ramp built inside the pyramid to deliver materials for the upper 2/3, a ramp that is still there, hidden inside of the structure. Some of the images that you're looking at here, you also see wooden hoists that would have been inserted into notches in the blocks to turn them, to move them to the next part of the internal ramp. So although they lacked modern tools, one thing the Egyptians had was plenty of manpower. Whether they were slaves or agricultural workers recruited for service after the harvests is still in debate. It is believed that as many as 25,000 men labored on the pyramids for up to 4 months each year for at least 20 years. What went into the building of these pyramids is a testament to the absolute, awesome, and awful power of the pharaohs. Today, tourists enter the Great Pyramid through the Robbers Tunnel, dug around 820 CE. The tunnel is cut straight through the masonry of the pyramid for approximately 89 feet, and then it turns sharply left to encounter the granite blocking stones in the ascending passage. So they were unable to remove these stones, and the workmen instead tunneled up beside them through the softer limestone of the pyramid until they reached the ascending passage. It is possible to enter the descending passage from this point, but access is usually forbidden. One mystery of the pyramid's construction is its planning. It is believed that they used the same method that had been used for earlier and later constructions, laying out parts of the plan on the ground at a 1-to-1 scale, or like this, on plastered and painted wood tablets, such as this fragment from an architectural drawing showing part of a small shrine. The shrine faces a body of water, which again we know is indicated by zigzag symbols. And then it's surrounded by trees within an enclosure wall of mud brick. The enclosure wall you see as thick, solid lines. An orchard, also enclosed, runs parallel to the water. The measurements of the walls are written from right to left, and each begins with a hieroglyph in the shape of sort of like a forearm, which actually means cubit, which is the Egyptian unit of length. This symbol is followed in each case by a number, which is an elongated semicircle that stands for 10 and just a stroke mark that stands for 1. So let's take a closer look at this. There are 3 elongated semicircles, which would equal 30, and there's 2 individual stroke marks. So the orchard is 32 cubits. This small sketch depicts a frequently occurring group of hieroglyphs meaning life, prosperity, and dominion. The grid lines allowed the artist to draw the hieroglyphs at whatever scale was needed. Another monumental structure, the Great Sphinx of Giza, was constructed near the pyramids at Giza. Many Egyptologists believe it was Khufu's son Khafur, builder of the second pyramid, who ordered the building of the Sphinx in approximately 2500 BCE. It is the largest monolith statue in the world, still, and oldest known monumental sculpture. In English, the Great Sphinx translates to the terrifying one. The statue is a reclining mythical creature with a lion's body and a human head, probably meant to represent Khafur himself. The sculpture is 66 feet high and 240 feet long. It was carved from a solid outcropping of limestone on the Giza Plateau, with limestone blocks added. You'll learn more about the Great Pyramid in the next media assignment. I'll see you next time.